World of Warcraft hasn't been dying from a single blow. It's been a painful bleed caused by a long series of decisions. How does a game loved by so many lose all of its magic? I started playing World of Warcraft in 2004 with vanilla, and after watching it decline, I've identified 15 core reasons why it lost its soul that so many players fell in love with. Much of what I'm talking about is rooted in the original spirit of WoW, especially the early days. Some of it is a product of its time, and even with World of Warcraft Classic, the game today can't fully recapture what made it feel so special back then. And I like to think about WoW players in three rough groups. The first wave, Vanilla through Wrath. The second wave, Cataclysm to Legion, where many early players moved on. And finally, the more modern players, from Battle of Azeroth onwards. Depending on where you started, what you value in WoW is probably different. I'm part of the older generation, but even if you're newer, I hope this gives you a fresh perspective on why some players feel the way they do. This is a big topic, and it's hard to analyze everything in isolation, so I've grouped my thoughts into 5 areas: immersion, progression, community, gameplay, and a final category for everything else. There will be some hot takes, so I hope you're ready. The rest of this video will be mostly audio only, meant to be a deeper, more reflective listen. If you're still here, thanks for sticking around. Now sit back and enjoy. I wanted to start off with immersion, because immersion, I think, is one of those things that really was the key component to why I love this video game and why I think a lot of people love this video game. And I think it goes beyond just this kind of buzzword of immersion. It's really, if I had to kind of think about a way to phrase this, it's almost like you're living within the world of Warcraft. That's what I think about when I think about immersion, living within the world of Warcraft. And this immersion is what creates that emotional resonance you have with this video game. It's that feeling of why you have such nostalgia for the video game, why you have such strong memories and strong emotional experiences with this video game. In tandem with that are the RPG mechanics and the rules of the world that help you to be immersed and to live within the world of Warcraft. And so I think that World of Warcraft, whether they did this intentionally or not, I think that some of these design decisions they did do intentionally, but in some ways they were unintentional. And you see this in really amazing video games, but it's this immersion and it's the concept of the wild. So when you played vanilla World of Warcraft or just the old World of Warcraft, there's this kind of concept of the wild, the wilderness, where you have you going out from the city, the settlement, into danger. And within that danger, you need to prepare. You know, there's this concept of needing to get food, to get water, to get all these things to prepare for your leveling journey. But within that, there are different levels of ranges of the game. So there's these high level zones, there's elites, there's non-scaling within the video game, there's PvP, there's this non-evenly distributed section of where there might be a really powerful monster that wanders the zone. It's this concept of the wild that kind of keeps you immersed in the world. And I think with a lot of newer World of Warcraft, it's kind of gone away from this idea. The concept of the wild, I think, is very important. And a lot of things that I think people get annoyed by with kind of gameplay mechanics, while these gameplay mechanics are annoying, they kind of help sell the immersion of the world. And so these are things like having to get food and water because you have to rest after a combat encounter. It's things like having to get repairs or prepare. If you're a hunter, you need to get ammo or you need to get food for your pet. Things like that are annoyances, but they make you have to prepare to go out in the wild. You're almost punished if you didn't bring food or water, right? You're punished if you didn't maintain your gear. It almost kind of adds this onus that, hey, you messed up, and yes, you lost 10 minutes of time because you didn't repair your gear or something like that, but it sells the believability of the world. And then within that, there's the concept of the city, which is basically kind of where there's the bank, there's the auction house, there's a center of trade, there's people selling goods, there's stores, there's trainers, there's these immersion of safety, this immersion of living within the city and then the wilderness. And then within the wilderness, it's not scaled. It's not just like there's no sense of danger. There is danger. If you go north of Orgrimmar into Ashara, there is a high level zone. And if you're level 10, you're in trouble. Or if you go out into kind of those contested zones, you could be attacked by the enemy faction. Or if you go into a certain zone, there are high level monsters or elites. There's this kind of sense of danger that it's trying to immerse you in within the world. And the thing about it too is that so many of these RPG mechanics within World of Warcraft are gone. One of those things is like, for example, if you're a rogue, having to prepare poison. And I know a lot of people look at this and they go, well, this is stupid. It's a waste of time. And in some respects, maybe it is. And in some respects, I think that people have kind of changed their mindsets with how immersion is by making it more of a convenience factor with video games and not having to do these things. But when you do this too much, you lose the immersion and the RPG mechanics of the world. Going to that seedy area of Orgrimmar, and that's where you get the poisons, right? That's where you go to prepare and to get more damage as a rogue. Helps to build this sense that you are role playing as a rogue. You know, if you're a hunter, you go into the store to go and buy food for your pet, and you're broke, and you're like, wow, I love my pet, but we're gonna have to go with the cheaper fruit this time because he's just, I'm running out of money. You know, you have this kind of sense of immersion when you do that. You know, you're going to the ammo store, and you go to the ammo store so many times that you almost kind of recognize the vendor. You're in this kind of world, in this RPG element. And I think that some of this RPG mechanics are lost in current World of Warcraft. And it's something that kind of makes the game so special. I think a lot of people don't necessarily, think about this consciously. They're not really thinking about the concept of the city, the concept of the wilderness, and the danger that those kind of present. But it's something that is happening, I think, under the hood. Psychologically, it's happening underneath the hood. And there's so much of this aspect that I think helps build the world and believability of the world. So, there's one aspect which is distance kind of creates the world, right? You have this huge map, and you travel between kind of all these different points in the world where you need, for example, zeppelins or boats or mounts, traveling to dungeons, which to me, I think it's one of those things where people hate the idea of having to travel to the dungeon. It's like you're wasting time. It's 20 minutes of not playing the game. But I would argue that the idea of traveling to the dungeon, it helps you to be immersed in the world, right? You don't just teleport there. It's not just this instance. And when you do things like that, you lose immersion. You're no longer living in a world anymore. You're no longer role-playing as the warrior. It's just you're teleported there instantaneously, and you lose something. There's something about the RPG that's lost when you lose some of these ideas that are helping you to roleplay. It might be annoying, and it might be inconvenient to repair your gear. It might be annoying that you have to get food and water, or there's a little bit of downtime between combat encounters, but all these things help sell the believability of the world. They help to build a sense of progression. They help to build relatability to kind of real life. And I think that when you lose those things and you do this too much, you lose things. I mean, you saw this with looking for group and looking for raid, but so much of this kind of immersion are these kind of small little things here and there, right? The small things where you had to go to a city to your class trainer, and then you probably don't have a ton of money, but you got those skills and you felt stronger. You felt more powerful. There's this concept of you just leveled up and you get to go to the class trainer to see what new skills you have, or maybe you can finally use a piece of gear that's stored in your bank. You go to the city because there's a sense of rest when you enter Stormwind or Ironforge or Orgrimmar, and you feel rested. And there's also like this kind of concept of the inn where it's like, okay, I'm logging off for the day. Let me go to an inn because I want to get that rested XP bonus, right? Because it'll help you. It's not just like you're going super fast through the levels. You want to get that rested XP bonus. And because of this shared idea, you see other people at the inn because they're getting the rested XP bonus. And so it adds this social aspect, because when you think about the inn in real life, you're going to the inn to essentially rest, right? This is where travelers rest. And so now you're encouraging social encounters. You see other players, and maybe you see someone with a really cool sword. And then that kind of ties into this progression element. And it opens up more of this believability of the world just from this small little thing of the inn, just like the small little thing of repairing your gear. All these things kind of add up into this immersion experience, which I think happens for a lot of people underneath the hood. And the thing about it too is there's kind of like this exploration and mystery of the world. And to be honest with you, this is just so hard to basically do nowadays because of guides and the optimization of everything. Everyone is just a lot more competitive with video games. But I think when you played World of Warcraft back in the day, there was less of this over-optimization of a bunch of ideas in video games. There might have been stuff like Thoughtbot, if anyone knows what that is. And, you could kind of somewhat get an idea of how to do quests and gear progression and stuff, but there was a lot more mystery to the world. And I think that there was just kind of this mystery that added to the immersion of the world. So, a classic example of this, I think, is like the wetlands. So if you played as a night elf, you would try to get to Ironforge or Stormwind. And so you had to cross the wetlands. And the wetlands is a kind of a level 20 to 30 zone. And so basically you're under leveled if you didn't play the classical progression path with night elves. And so you almost kind of had to like figure out, how am I going to get to Ironforge? And I remember actually doing this back in the day where I looked at the map. There was I wasn't looking at an internet guide. I was looking at the map going, okay, how do I get here? How do I get to this city? And so I'm kind of trying to map it out. I don't have the world mapped out. And so I'm just trying to like follow this road. And then I finally get to the mountains, and I've like died a couple of times. And so I'm trying to get on this journey, and I'm encountering all these crocodiles, and I'm seeing all these crazy things. I'm like, wow, this is crazy. Never seen this before. And finally I get to Loch Modine, and I see this great, amazing dam and lake, and I'm like immersed. I'm like, wow, this is crazy. And I finally get to Ironforge, and I feel this sense of relief. And it's just like, this immersion, this experience, I mean, that sticks with you. How do you replicate that? That's just this immersion that I'm talking about. And like, if you go and play Classic right now, and I try to like tell you the story, you're gonna like laugh at me because it's like, what are you talking about? You know, there's a guide here, this is how you do it. People have optimized this to death. But like at the time, this was kind of this idea, this experience. And like I said, you can't exactly translate it to 2025. But I think that this idea of the immersion, the things that I'm talking about, this role playing, these rules of the world help to sell the believability of the world. And you can take that concept of the wetlands and apply it to video games nowadays into something different. Obviously, it's not the same because of streamers, because of guides and stuff like that. But this kind of helped to sell the believability of the world, at least at the time of when this game happened. And I think that's really important. And the thing is, too, I think that like there was also just this sense of danger within the world. And a lot of this, I think, was this open world PvP, which I know a lot of people hate. They don't like to get ganked by some rogue, or they want to level up and they want to just continue about their day. But like, you have to understand that once again, this kind of goes back to this immersion aspect of things, which basically there was a sense of danger in the world. And it's almost like the experience was not necessarily about getting to level 60 quicker. It wasn't about everything going your way, because that is the immersion of the world, right? You live within the World of Warcraft, and the World of Warcraft is brutal. Just like everything else, there's parts of it that are unfair. There are parts that are challenging. And I think some people would argue, well, I'm just here to play a video game. But the thing is, it just sells the believability of the world. And this open world PvP increased the sense of danger in the world. When you were trying to do the Nessingwary quests, you're kind of scouting it out a little bit. You're just saying, okay, is there like 3 Alliance members there? And you're like, okay, there are like a bunch of Alliance people over there. I have to go somewhere else. Or there's a level 60. Maybe I can kind of knock out this quest a little bit and try to be safe. It kind of adds this immersion and this kind of gameplay twist on things that you just can't replicate when everything is safe. Everything is easy. I mean, it's a different gameplay experience. And I know like a lot of people will say this is not fun, but it's helping to sell the immersion of the world. This helps to sell the emotional experience of the world. And you don't have to take these concepts verbatim in a new video game, but they just add to things. They add to things. And the thing is too, this PvP, this open world PvP, it adds randomness. So when you go into the modern World of Warcraft, there's no danger. You auto win. There's no sense of dying by getting attacked by 3 mobs. There's no sense that there's an enemy faction that does not like you. And this sense of randomness adds immersion. It adds emotional tension to the game. And there's many different outcomes. You can get ganked and attacked and killed by a rogue, for example, or a warrior. Or you could have a peaceful encounter where a level 60 waves at you. You're on the road and you're trying not to make eye contact with this level 60 warrior, and they stop and they just wave at you and bow, and that's that. And it's like, okay, that was interesting. This was a nice warrior. Or you see something amazing and epic where you're just leveling up in Hillsbrad Foothills and you see this 30 on 30 PvP battle happening on this rogue, and there's all these spells flying about, and you weren't expecting it. You were just going in to turn in a quest, and you saw this crazy experience happening. Or you saw this hilarious moment where there is a druid and he's ready to attack you, but he doesn't realize that there are 3 people in your faction right behind you, and he's running for his life, and he's about to get owned. I mean, that is this randomness, these hilarious moments that you can't have if you don't have the open world PvP, if you don't have the sense of danger, if you don't take in this idea that there's an inconvenience factor to it. And like I said, when you look at classic WoW now, the game is just, it's not the same as it was in 2004. I went back and played the game. I got a character to level 60, but the game is just, it's not the same. It's just been so over-optimized, and this open world PvP social mechanic, it's very different than what it was. So, I mean, if that was your first time playing it, it's somewhat of a representation of it, but not exactly. This open world PvP, as an example, shows the danger of the world, and it adds to this immersion concept that I'm talking about. And of course, there's another element, which I think a lot of people have talked about before, which is the concept of the nobody, where, you know, in vanilla WoW, and to maybe, I guess, a lesser extent, Burning Crusade and Wrath of the Lich King, you were kind of a nobody. The main character is the world, not you. It's the World of Warcraft. You're just some person. I like to think of it as kind of like a wandering knight, a wandering sorceress, something like that. And because you're a nobody, it's almost like you're building your own reputation within the world. And there's kind of like this kind of mock of the real world, but it adds to this immersion. So you have people that are part of like the best guild on your server. And so there's this kind of prestige status, or there's kind of this reputation for certain guilds. There's an enchanter in your realm where they're the person that has all the best enchantments, or you kind of go to an artisan that you have a good experience trading with them. Or there's kind of that person with a reputation as a ninja looter, or there's the really good skilled warrior or priest, or there's an elitist. and he's just kind of not very fun to play with. Or there's that guy that's absolutely hilarious. And there's so many different examples of this that I can think of. I mean, I remember way back in the day, there was a guy that would just kind of hang out in trade chat, and he talked in the third person, and he would just talk in the third person, and it was almost like that was the special character of Orgrimmar. He was just the character that kind of added a sense of immersion and community into the world. Or there was the one guy who had the two-handed sword from Zul'Gurub, and you kind of saw him in the auction house, and you remember seeing him. Or the first person to get High Warlord on your server. Or I remember there was a dwarf that had Thunder Fury. So there's just this kind of aspect to things that adds to this sense of immersion, where you are a nobody, but you can make it in the world, whether it's through a guild association or your own reputation and stuff like that. And it almost kind of models aspects from the real world. So there's like people that are really good with money. They have their mount at level 40. And then there's people that are bad with money, and they're basically panhandling at level 39 because they have 1 gold to their name. But then you had people that were entrepreneurial and they were really good at making gold. And then other people, maybe not necessarily. Or you had people that, like I said, had this certain type of reputation. You had certain people that added their own personality and twist to the game. And this immersion, like I said, helps sell the believability of the world. You're living within it. And I think that was something that was really special. And the thing is too, there was no sharding in the world at the time. And that was one of the things that was really destructive to World of Warcraft, in my opinion, where you had this sharding in instances and you lost this sense of community with the game. And because of that, you lost all the things that I mentioned, the characters and personalities, the server identity, especially too when combined with others, especially with Battlegrounds, you kind of lost this sense of community with things, which I'll talk about more, but those kind of aspects, the destruction of the community also kind of hurts the world building in so many different ways. But also beyond this sense of the community, I think that another thing that's really important is the unobtainability of items in the world. And so, it kind of goes back to this modeling of the real world, and you are a resident of Azeroth, of living within the world. And so there are these unattainable items, just like in real life. So if you are a orc, it's very hard to get that raptor mount because you have to get exalted reputation to get the raptor mount. And so there's this kind of unobtainability, but you want it. And maybe you aspire for it. Or there's that certain weapon from a dungeon or a raid or from PvP. You want the honor system rank. And so there's these like things that kind of help you to give you a sense of progress. But then there's these things also that you'll never get. You're probably never going to get the gear from Blackwing Lair. But it's okay though. Not every player needs the gear from Blackwing Lair. It almost, because there are pieces of gear that most players will never achieve, most players will never even experience the content, it gives them a sense of the brutalness of the world. It gives them a sense of immersion and a sense of the unobtainability. It models real life. It models something very innate within humans where you're not going to go to Blackwing Lair. You're not going to get this certain piece of gear, but it adds to the world. The fact that you don't even get it, that's fine. It serves its purpose within the world. And it serves its purpose in terms of building your immersion. Even if you don't see it, I think it's happening at a very subconscious level. And the thing is too, this happens with so many different things, whether it's the mount, the gear, the PvP, the overall progression. And the other thing too is there's like the brutalness of the world too. Things are not fair. I mean, especially back in old World of Warcraft, if you wanted an epic item, you had to earn it. You had to get the money to buy it, or you had to do raids. And I think now, and especially kind of even before now, epics were devalued in what they were. Superiors were devalued, and things were just kind of given out for free. Or the concept of doing the dungeon or the raid, everyone will be able to experience it with looking for raid. And I think that this, like I said, destroys the immersion because, like I said, it's almost like a model of the real world. Some things are hard. Some things take a while. Some things are annoyances, and some things are not for everyone, and not everyone will achieve them. And that's okay. And I think that it was helpful to kind of have those aspirational ideas, or this kind of air of mystery where there's Blackwing Lair over there. I don't know what it is. I know about it, but it's something that exists within the world. And I think a lot of people might really disagree with me on this because they're like, why every player should enjoy the content that they create. And there's all these kind of different people saying, oh, I need to experience Blackwing Lair. Everyone needs to have this experience. But once again, it destroys the immersion. I think that it's important to understand that for every decision you make with these kind of gameplay design decisions, you lose something in return. And so yes, is it good in a way that more people get to experience the content? Yes, but you lose immersion. And it's like these slow cuts that destroy things. I think a lot of people might disagree with me on this, but I'm just trying to help try to sell this idea of the world of the immersion. Because like I said, there's the modeling of the world, the brutalness of the world that not everyone has the same amount of gold. Not everything is easy. There are things that you will never obtain. There are situations where, going to the dungeon is a brutal experience. It's difficult. And I think that there's just another thing that is so critical to this. And I think a lot of people might not like me because they like the Burning Crusade, but the Burning Crusade really destroyed immersion. And it really was a design decision that has had long-lasting consequences, because basically it separated the player base. And so you kind of got into this world where everyone was living within the World of Warcraft in Azeroth, and then you added this kind of separate area where now if you're a high-level player, you just kind of went to these new zones, and that was that. And so now the world is separated. And so like if you played vanilla and then you played the Burning Crusade and you kind of go back to Azeroth, I mean, it was like something was seriously affected as a result of that, because now all the high-level content was somewhere else. And so that was such in my opinion, a terrible design decision. And it's only gotten worse as more of the expansions have come out. You saw the same thing happen with Northrend, with Wrath of the Lich King, and with kind of all the new zones and areas, to the point where now it's just this world that is just this huge, too many separated, instanced off areas. And, in vanilla, the world kind of had more relevance. Every zone kind of had more relevance and a reason for people to go to certain areas, even if certain zones were more of a leveling zone. So, for example, you had all the capital cities. Certain cities, for example, you could only get master training for certain crafting skills. There was the only place to go to get an auction house or a bank was, the major cities. If you wanted to go to the neutral auction house, you had to go to Booty Bay or Gadgetan. If you wanted to go raid, you went to the Searing Gorge. If you wanted to go to Encourage, it was Silphus. And then there would be people kind of doing some PvP in Tannerus or Stranglethorn Vale. There was the arena there was Zul'Gurub. And then you had people just hanging out outside of Durotar where they were dueling, outside of Orgrimmar. Or you just had people that wanted to socialize and talk on Barrens chat. And so there was people in the Barrens, people were taking the boat from Ratchet to Booty Bay. There was just kind of more of this built-in kind of component to the world. There was a reason to go to these different places, even at a higher level. And so with these expansions and that model, it really changed things. And it really changed things for the worst, in my opinion, because seeing the players and seeing people just coexisting within the world, whether it was a high-level player or a low-level player, I think really added to things. And on top of that, another thing that Burning Crusade did was flying mounts, another absolutely destructive component to the game, irrecoverable in so many different ways, which really changed the way in terms of how people experience the world, because now PvP encounters completely changed. The way that you traversed a world was lost. You lost enjoying some of the artists' kind of work from the sky. And at the same time too, it was this very strong step away from the idea of the nobody, because now everyone has flying mounts. Now you're kind of transforming into this idea of the hero versus the wandering traveler, right? You could easily see, like, if you're a wandering warrior, a wandering mercenary, that person might have a horse or a wandering druid. But now you start adding dragons and flying mounts, there's less of this. It doesn't seem realistic that everyone has a flying mount now. And I think that, like, some people go, well, this is just convenient and everything else. But like I said, it does this slight underneath the hood destruction of things, whether it's the PvP encounters, how you experience the world, seeing other players, how you grind for things when it's profession materials. It just changes things. I really do think that flying mounts were a terrible idea. And like I said, separating the player base into kind of these different regions just was really terrible. And it really, really affected things, I think, so much for the worst. Like I said, I really love the exploration and mystery of the world. Me and my friend at the time, we loved to try to explore some of these unfinished areas within World of Warcraft. I don't know if anyone ever tried to do these things, but like we went to the unreleased zones, like Hyjal, Mount Hyjal, where you had to like kind of do this jumping kind of thing to get over into the area. There's this area, and this is kind of less hidden, between Nagrand that's a little creepy with the nursery village. And I think that like I said, this is kind of an old concept, like where the internet was still a little young and early, that kind of had this kind of air of mystery and discovery with things. And I think it's hard to replicate that, but it's something that, like I said, adds to the experience of things quite a bit. And I think too, like with this, the world just has, more relevance in World of Warcraft. And I think that that's such a huge selling point with the separated player base. The future expansions kind of got onto this routine where you kind of got stuck in this loop of where the content was raids, dungeons, and arena seasons. And I think that when you did that, essentially now the content of the world changed. It became less about the world and it became about this kind of specific content. And I understand why it happened, because once they kind of went with that design decision, it's kind of hard to break away. And yes, they added some other content to the game, like achievements and pet battles and stuff like that, but you ultimately stuck to this formula where you had new dungeons, new raids, new arenas, and then kind of like this 10 leveling experience. But I think that that really changed the game. It changed the world and the immersion and how you interacted with people on the road because of the way that things went. It kind of almost trained players to think about the game differently as a form of doing raids and content versus kind of living within this world in this MMORPG. And I think that it did a lot to destroy the immersion of the game. And I think another thing too, which this is just, I think the inevitable cycle of things, there's just also now a lack of mystery. Everything is kind of solved, and there's just kind of this optimization with guides and trying to do everything efficiently. And I think that this has definitely affected MMORPGs in general, but if there was ever, MMORPGs in the future that try to solve this, it's trying to add that mystery to the world, because even if you play classic WoW now, the game is so solved. I mean, so many people are so optimized with how they play a certain character class or with PvP or dungeons that I think that it changes the experience. It changes these immersion aspects. I mean, people have seen this content again and again. And so if you play now or you see people playing it like again for the third or fourth time, it's just a very different experience. It's not to say that it's a bad experience or you can't have fun with it, but it's just not, I think, hitting a lot of the core items that I'm saying with regards to this immersion in the world building. And of course, the last thing I wanted to say about immersion is the music. The music in this game was amazing. It set the mood for the game. The WoW login music, it still just kind of brings chills down my spine. I love it. I love that song. It's one of the best. The Wrath login is also just incredibly amazing. And of course, who could forget Grizzly Hills, right? Amazing. I mean, when you just listen to that, it gets you this emotional feeling. Howling Fjord as well. And of course, two top tier raid themes. Ulduar's music was amazing. Karazhan. You enter Karazhan and you kind of have that opera feeling, and that it just builds this sense of immersion in the game. Of course, Canaris. You feel this kind of emptiness of the desert. Stranglethorn Vale, Orgrimmar, Nomergon, Barrens, Ironforge, Stormwind. All these music pieces are amazing. And World of Warcraft has kind of consistently had great music, but it's just one of those things that I think sold the world. I don't really have any complaints about the music in WoW, but I think it's one of those things that really kind of helps sell the world. So now I want to talk about progression, okay? And so progression, I think in vanilla World of Warcraft, there's like many sources of progression. And so this kind of helped the game because, like I said, you're living in the World of Warcraft and you have this RPG mechanic, but you had a lot of different ways to progress your character. There was the leveling. There was more of a focus on leveling as a core gameplay experience for a lot of people. It wasn't just rushing to the end or trying to get there as quickly as possible. It was the experience of it. And that's what I was saying back of the immersion thing, where there's these inconveniences and you say, this sucks, I don't want to do it. But they added the experience, whether it was the PvP encounters or having to repair or it's difficult to get a mount. Those things were a little bit, I think, more of a slower pace, but they added to the overall gameplay experience. Of course, you could also progress with gear. There was PvP progression, right? Whether it's arenas or your honor system ranking, and of course, raids and dungeons. You have professions, cosmetics, money, and achievements later on. And of course, alts. I think there was a lot more of a focus on alts where, let's say, you couldn't really progress on a certain character. You needed to do a dungeon, but you could start a new character. And then that character had this distinctive feel from it. So if you played a warrior and then you played a druid, it was very different, or a priest or something like that. And so it gave you maybe another sense of a feeling with the game. You got a different combat style. You got a different role in group encounters, or you play the other faction and you got a different sense of progression. You experienced the world from a different lens. There was the concept of unobtainable gear and the concept of aspiration, where this unobtainable gear kind of gave you a sense of progress. It gave you something to work towards, whether it was something as simple as a mount, your level 40 mount. It was difficult to achieve and get that money, or getting your epic mount, or trying to get gear or status or progression, maybe getting into that new guild. And I think that some of this aspiration is lost. I mean, when you're just given everything for free, it really hurts the game. Now, gear doesn't mean anything. It is just this thing that's given to you. The concept of the legendary weapon, the epic weapon, means nothing because everyone has an epic. A superior used to mean more if you were a character leveling up. And I think that when you have unobtainable gear, or you have aspiring gear or items, that helps to give you a sense of progression. And of course, this is not a new idea. People have done analyses on this ad nauseum, but I think that it's something important to kind of keep in mind. And some of it is annoying and difficult. And yes, it makes traversing the world difficult, but the fact that you had to kind of plan ahead, you had to save for a mount, and you had to think about, hey, I want this sword, and so I'm going to kind of get out of my comfort zone to do Scarlet Monastery to get this piece of gear, or I was forced to kind of be in these social encounters to kind of get gear that kind of gave you a sense of progression. And I liked it. There was kind of this unapologetic nature of, hey, if you want this gear, you better start getting social, you better start improving your character, and that's what was necessary. You know, if you want to do molten core, you need to get fire resistance gear. If you wanted to do this dungeon, you know, you had to go to the dungeon, you had to prepare. And so I think that I liked that idea because it gave people a sense of aspiration, and it was congruent and true to itself. And it added this level of progression because, like in the real world, not everything is easy, not everything is fair. And when everything is so easy and it's just given to you for free, or you can experience most of the content, and the only thing that's different is, I guess, like a heroic version, or, you know, just small little tweaks here and there, you lose this sense of progression. And I think another thing too that really hurt the game also was the expansion cycle of things. And it's almost kind of like playing the patch, playing the expansion, which really destroyed the core progression. I mean, I really don't know if I agreed with raising the level cap at the time for the Burning Crusade, where all these people's work and all this raid gear was invalidated. And it kind of led to this inevitable cycle where every single expansion, your gear was invalidated. And then now it's kind of more like on a patch by patch basis. And so the sense of progression becomes a lot more temporal. It becomes a lot less meaningful because you know that it's going to just kind of end one day. And so you just don't have this sense of progression with the gear. And I think that was just, it's something that really hurts the RPG mechanic of the game. It hurts the concept of your own progression within a role-playing game. And, you know, there's other games out there that are like EVE Online or old school RuneScape, where some of the older gear is still relevant when you play old school RuneScape or EVE Online. You might not have the best ship, but that ship is still useful for doing mining or certain encounters and stuff. And so I think those games have done a better job of keeping progression relevant years later. And WoW just invalidated the content before it. It's such a destructive force, destructive idea that really changed the sense of progression. And like I said, this dumbing down of content or making it accessible to everyone was also a key destruction aspect of things. Now, beyond that, there's also kind of this idea I like to say of, it's like the fast food of progression, where a lot of things kind of changed in the later expansion packs with World of Warcraft, whether it's, and some people are going to disagree with me on this, where a lot of gear became badge oriented. It was not about getting the sword, or you started having kind of daily quests. Daily quests almost kind of, it changed player psychology. It changed the way that people played the video game. And then a lot of these dungeons became a lot easier. And so people just kind of went to the dungeons on autopilot mode versus, you know, in the past, you had to kind of think about things. There were things you had to do. You had to have a second tank. You had to root enemies. You had to do crowd control. And that kept people engaged in the game, right? It's almost like, you know, a really engaging video game, in my opinion, is one where you're entirely focused on it. Like if you can listen to YouTube on in the background, or you can just kind of not think about things, like I think that a lot of the engagement of that gameplay mechanic is missing. It's like if you can play YouTube and play the video game at the same time, it almost kind of detracts from the experience. It's almost like you're on autopilot mode. And I think WoW adopted a lot of those mechanics kind of moving forward as time went on. And I think that these things kind of hurt, once again, the sense of progression. It hurt the sense of difficulty and the average player's individual sense of progression. And, you know, another thing too, this is going to be just another one that people are going to hate, is I think that the PvP progression was botched. There was such a huge opportunity with the honor system, but like, I think you could have done something there with a broader PvP system and kind of made it something better. I think there was not a lot of focus on it. And it wasn't that everyone had to get high warlord, but I just think the system could have been expanded on at the time. I think I got to Legionnaire when I was playing vanilla. So let me just go on an aside here about this. Well, I'll actually wait on this one. we'll talk about this one, the gameplay mechanics. This will be a fan favorite, I think, for a lot of people. So another thing that is going to be some pretty hot topics here. So the and this kind of happened a little bit later on. I think a lot of things kind of already had set in when this became a factor, but the devaluing of money really changed this game. I mean, this was an extremely destructive aspect of the video game. And basically, when you could buy gold, microtransactions fundamentally destroyed progression. I mean, now the auction house is more of a reflection of real life. Now you're almost incentivized to buy things. And now everything is contaminated by this, whether it's dungeon runs or arenas, things like that. That really changes things for the worst. I really hate the idea where people say, well, if you don't want to buy gold, just don't do it. Like as if that does not change the overarching progression of the world and how your character fits within that world relative to other people. The immersion aspect is ruined because now you have the infiltration of money, and then that destroys individual progression, and you feel stupid for not buying the gold. And of course, by this point, I think the game had already suffered significant wounds, but it's another thing that really has hurt the progression of World of Warcraft. And with that kind of core aspect in there, and it'll never really be removed, there's no curing this disease. I mean, it's such a destructive aspect to overall progression within the game. It becomes a reflection of real life. It loses the core identity of the RPG mechanics that I've mentioned. It's so destructive. It almost kind of doesn't even really need further saying. And of course, cosmetic microtransactions also ruined a sense of progression with buyable mounts and stuff like that, where now the world is kind of contaminated by outside influences. And of course, by influences that also might not be relevant to the lore and the immersion of the game itself. And so these cosmetic microtransactions and overall microtransactions are just another small little wound in the game where it hurts the progression system of the game overall. And of course, here's another one, okay? A lot of people are gonna hate this. I mean, I'm telling you, this is gonna be really unpopular, but I really think that transmog was one of the worst things to ever happen to this video game. Transmog was so destructive to this video game. And I already can see it now, the outrage of this comment. But here's the thing about transmog. I understand that transmog gave life to the game. It gave a reason for people to go back and do old dungeons and raid content. It gave them more time to stay subscribed to the game. And of course, you want people to look the way they want to look. But it goes back to this immersion aspect that I was talking about earlier, where now when you saw the person with the really cool gear, you saw that that character had a sense of power and progression. You know, you associated something with him. And it's just like with real life, like this sense of progression is tied to the gear. And so when you can just look like anything that you want to look like, your sense of progression is catastrophically altered as a result of this. So if you like the tier 1 raid sets, which, you know, I love them, they're all awesome. The warrior set is amazing. The rogue set's awesome. Priest set's awesome. You know, all that stuff. Yes, they're awesome. But now that you have your character kind of dressed how you want, and it's almost also this like ultra elite gear, now what are you working towards? Nothing. You already have the cool gear. And so in a way, by having transmog, you've almost altered your own psychology towards the game. And not everyone's going to be affected like that, but it fundamentally alters your sense of progression with the game, because now you're no longer aspiring for the next piece of gear. You're no longer aspiring for the next thing. And then of course the community is altered, because now you have no semblance of who is a top raider, who is the top PvPer, where someone stands. And I think there's a balance for it. Maybe you could have transmog and have some sort of social dynamic, some sort of social system that allows for transmog and that can exist within the world. But it's just something that I think so fundamentally alters progression and the way that you feel within it, that it really hurts the sense of progression within the video game. And I know that's a really unpopular opinion, but I really don't think that it was one of the greatest things to happen to the game. I think it really has altered the progression of the video game. Of course, another thing too, and this is, like I said, so many wounds had happened by this point, but the overabundance of mounts, pets, and gear has clearly affected progression as well. And this is a hard thing to fix, and I think it's hard for in MMORPGs, because, you know, there's so many mounts where, because you have so many mounts, there's less of the sense of feeling of excitement when you get the new mount. Or there's so many mounts that people have a hard time keeping track of what is rare and the sense of comparison with other people and stuff like that. One thing that I've always felt like was a way to kind of combat this and to help with this was to have old content still be useful, and to have a way of disposal of old gear. And so this is what I really like about the concept of EVE Online and old school RuneScape, where you have the wilderness or you have nullsec in those games, where basically if you die, or kind of more broadly within EVE Online, you lose all your gear. And so you could easily see a world where there's a PvP kind of wilderness, and so people could have gear be destroyed. And so it kind of creates more of this less overabundance of things. But also, if you have gear and content that's still relevant, some gear and items and stuff are still relevant for older content. Now, how do you apply that to stuff like mounts and pets? I don't know. Maybe there's a way to travel the desert with only certain mounts, or there was certain pets that you needed for certain things, or certain gear was really great at fire resistance, or something like that. So obviously this is a very fundamental change and difference between, you know, World of Warcraft and RuneScape and EVE Online, but it's still something that could have fixed it. But of course, this is something that obviously has been a long-term effect of the game that's very difficult to happen. And of course, another thing that I think I feel really sad about, but it's so hard to do, and so many MMORPGs fail at it, is crafting was basically abandoned at some point. And, you know, crafting always kind of had a little bit of a struggle. I think it was probably in its best place in vanilla World of Warcraft, but it gave you a sense of progression outside of achievements and, you know, within raiding and dungeons and PvP. And it was something that was just kind of very chill. It added immersion to the video game. And I think that people even if it was a naivety, even if it was a realization that, most of this profession stuff was just a money sink to nowhere, it did add a sense of progress for people. It did add a sense of fun. There was something nice about just working on professions, not necessarily leveling up or trying to get gear. And like I said, a lot of this crafting wasn't necessarily useful per se, but I think it really did add to the sense of progression for a lot of characters. And so now I wanted to talk about the community aspect of things. And so really, this is kind of a core idea where the destruction of the community and the social aspect of World of Warcraft has been one of these really big, deep wounds. And it's hard to kind of put one single item on this, but I think that like if you had to kind of over encompass one of the big wounds to World of Warcraft, I think it's been the destruction of the community and the social aspects of World of Warcraft. And there's so many different components to this, but I think that like sharding and the elimination of unique server communities really affected things. This was a critical destruction point, whether it was things like trying to get better queue times in battlegrounds where there was less of a server identity, whether it was you don't know if the people that you are next to are in your world, there's a lack of continuity. And of course, I understand why people did sharding in terms of performance improvements on the servers or for battleground queue times and stuff like that, but there has to be a balance. And I think that when you lose this balance, you lose the sense of community. And remember, you're living within the world of Warcraft. And I think that's very critical to remember. So much of World of Warcraft is really not about the content. I know there's a lot of people that they look at World of Warcraft and they think of it as a solo experience, but this game started fundamentally as a MMORPG, which are very social in nature. And I think that so many people's emotional resonance with the game comes from the experience you have with other players. It comes from the experience of overcoming that raid or just leveling up with someone or having those social experiences. In so many ways, that social aspect really makes video games in so many different experiences that much more powerful. I think a lot of people overlook this idea where just playing with other human beings and having the sense of community really can just add more emotional resonance to the game itself. And because of this kind of separation of sharding of realms and servers and stuff, I think you saw a lot of reputation within the server loss. There was less of this sense of guilds. There was less of the server ninja looter or these kind of top PvPers and personalities. And this has kind of been separated a little bit by streamers and stuff like that. But the core world and identity of World of Warcraft, I think, has been lost in so many ways. And this kind of socialness aspect, I think that it kind of goes in so many different ways. It's like almost like the concept of the roughness of the group. And so many people would disagree with me on this one because, some people would go, I don't want my time wasted because this druid is bad at the game, or I have to go to the dungeon and we keep getting attacked along the way. I think that there is something to the experience about overcoming challenges when someone is underleveled or undergeared or they're not very good at the game. And I think that this concept of working with other humans, despite the challenges, really adds to the sense of the game. Now, a lot of people might disagree with me on this, but I do think it's a component that's pretty huge. And of course, going back to this, the danger of the world, the danger of the road, PvP, when you have this sense of community and the open world PvP aspect, things just feel more dangerous. It keeps you in that immersion of the game. And the PvP of the game is slowly eroded dramatically. And I think that PvP is kind of always under assault. And a lot of people, of course, think of World of Warcraft as a PvE game. And I understand that. But I think that the PvP and that dynamic between the Horde and the Alliance, the Horde versus Alliance dynamic has very clearly eroded as time has gone on. Where, back in the day, there was almost this sense of competition and edge to it. And really, to be honest with you, I think it's just this like thing that really added immersion to the game. It added this sense of community where you said, I'm on the Horde side, or I'm a member of the Alliance. And I think that it added competitive spirit with PvP. It added a competitive spirit with raiding and dungeons. And it also just added edge to the world, which I think has been lost slowly over time. The social dynamic, these kind of encounters where you had basically socialness of the world, where essentially if you wanted to go to a center of trade and commerce, that's where you got things done. That's where you had to go to a bank or to go to the auction house. You needed to talk to an enchanter to get your gear enchanted. When you kind of have to just only interact with a menu to interact with artisans, it changes the dynamic of the game. And I know it's inconvenient, but it changes the immersion. It changes the cultural and the community aspect of things, which once again lowers your emotional experience with the video game. And I know that the game is very different, and people could argue with me saying, well, I have a crazy emotional experience with the modern game. That's fine, but I'm trying to explain kind of this old World of Warcraft idea and the things that go with it. When you kind of go to the inn, right, the cultural city, you see all the things that are adding to the world, right? You have the guild chat, you have Barons chat, which basically added a sense of immersion when you went to the Barons, even though it was just the Wild West in a way. You have a trade goods chat, you have people trading goods. There was more sociability in the video game, and you saw that sociability erode over time. And I think that part of it is those gameplay mechanics that enforced or almost kind of encouraged socialization. You had the people that would duel outside of Orgrimmar or outside of Ironforge. You had a sense of people that got the buff when one of the dragons was taken out. Like I said, these aspect of the city and having to go there to get certain things, whether it was class skills or something like that, adds more community, adds more sociability to the game, makes you feel a little more in the world. And then, of course, that adds these emotional experiences that you have that are tied to the video game itself. And when you start doing things like player holds, or you have like a portable banks and stuff like that, it changes the idea of the city. It changes the idea of the wilderness. It changes where you can socialize and communicate with. I think you saw a lot of that happen in Warlords of Draenor, but the Burning Crusade and the kind of the focus on raid content and dungeon content and arenas, I think the game also was already moving away from community aspects in so many different ways. And of course, the mindset of the player has changed too, especially with the modern day. You see a lot of more streamers and stuff like that. And so it kind of goes away from the old school internet where there was more of this kind of the chat room dynamic. There was kind of this more of a novelty to MMORPGs and socialization. There was, I think, a little bit more of an outcast culture with video games. And so I think those things encouraged community within World of Warcraft, and it's hard to replicate those things in the modern day with all these new dynamics. But I think that the sense of community, the sense of socialization adds to the immersion of the video game, and it adds to people's emotional experiences. I think humans are very social creatures by default. And so when you try to bring in these social aspects into a video game, it helps to make the gameplay a more memorable experience. It makes the game more amazing. And so, like I said, some of these community aspects, they're antiquated ideas. They're ideas that don't necessarily work in the modern day, but you can take these ideas, the rough concepts, and apply them to a new video game and still get something quite amazing out of it. So next we have the gameplay mechanics. And I think gameplay has changed quite a bit as World of Warcraft has gone on. But I think that a lot of it was kind of this lack of class identity that you see today, and a streamlining of classes where classes can basically do everything now. And this is kind of more of a late term aspect of destruction. I think a lot of things have already kind of happened by this point where the game was already kind of suffering from many different wounds. But there was almost kind of this RPG concept with this game. And I talked about this with the rogues with poisons, or these class quests that kind of added more RPG and immersion in the gameplay. And I think that this kind of helped to sell the believability of the world and helped sell you to be connected to your particular class, like going to the class trainer. And the class trainer would be in different places. And so you had to go to the city to go to the class trainer. And I think this added to the gameplay aspect of things. And like I said, there almost was this RPG aspect to skills and the way that you interacted with each of these classes. I think a lot of the skills were kind of maybe not necessarily the most useful, but it added to this experience and novelty of getting the new skill. And you seem to have more skills. I mean, it definitely seems like back in the day, you had more skills. You had more of this RPG aspect of things that really kind of helped to build a sense of progression and immersion as you roleplayed as a warrior, as a paladin, as a warlock, or whatever class. And I think that the talent trees were really supporting of this idea. It gave people a sense of progression and customization with their characters. Now, of course, there was always obviously the best talents, but not everyone, at least back then, played that way. It's not like it is today where everything is super over optimized. I mean, there was some of it, but there was more of this sense of customization with your character, which immersed you within your class in of itself. And like I said, I still think you can have this customization and this kind of immersion with the characters, but especially with the modern day and the focus on optimization and so many things like that, I do think you have to kind of change the way you approach this in newer video games. But the talent trees, I think, were very supportive of this. And I think that, I think it was Dragonflight. They try to bring back these kind of more expanded talent trees. I really don't know how well it turned out, but I think this is something that people really like about old World of Warcraft. And of course, classes had defined roles, and you had clear identities with this. And because the classes kind of had these defined roles and identities, it supported alts. So, you had characters that were tanks, you had healers and DPS, and then there was kind of different plays on that. And so it kind of gave you a reason to go create another alt. Maybe you saw this druid with really cool gear and you wanted to get to play a druid, or you saw this really cool weapon on a warrior and it made you want to start a Tauren warrior. And so I think that kind of defined roles that they fulfilled kind of added to things. When you had healers have a different dynamic in a dungeon, which was a different gameplay experience than playing as a DPS or playing as a tank. And I think this supported more gameplay opportunities, but it also kind of just gave you class immersion. And like I said, kind of previously, in the modern World of Warcraft, there's no danger anymore. I mean, there's almost no use for food and water. There's no risk. Everything seems a lot faster paced within modern World of Warcraft. And I understand why people might counteract this, where they might say, well, eating food and drinking water is not a fun gameplay mechanic, but it added kind of more of a methodicalness and slowness to the video game. And it added a sense of risk where getting attacked by 3 monsters might put you in a dangerous position, or attacked by 4 monsters versus, now it just seems so fast paced, so non-risk oriented. And I think that destroys the core gameplay. Like I said, it almost puts you more into an autopilot mode, and autopilot mode is not as engaging. You lose kind of a sense of progression and identity with your character. And it's those slow cuts that affect the game every little bit. And of course, as you're playing these games, I think the developers kind of had this focus on creating unique situations by the way they built the world. And you kind of entered into these unique gameplay encounters that were not necessarily core to the core gameplay of just leveling up and doing quests and killing monsters. So for example, with the way that Hillsbrad Foothills was, it almost kind of encouraged this PvP aspect with the closeness of the two settlements. And you saw that manifest in the world. Or with Scarlet Monastery, you saw that players of the Alliance had to travel through Horde territory to get to Scarlet Monastery. And so it added this sense of risk and immersion. Or Thorium Point was this kind of PvP hub in this kind of danger zone, even if you were a lower level character trying to level up, because of its proximity to the raids in Blackwing Lair or Molten Core or something like that. And so these unique situations kind of added unique twists on the gameplay, which I think there's a lot less of that. And that's because a lot of it was the focus on the world. There was these kind of situations that were set up to add unique gameplay experiences that added to that emotional resonance. Like I was talking about earlier, it's like the hunting camp in northern Stranglethorn Vale. It added this tension in PvP encounters, or the more like Booty Bay and Gadgetan. It almost kind of had this idea of this neutral town that was kind of a little dangerous. And then you had to be careful on your toes because there was a rogue that was trying to attack people. And then of course you see him just running out and getting slowly attacked by the goblin guards. It adds this sense of immersion in gameplay that's not really tied to the core gameplay of the game, which is leveling up your character, getting gear, and doing dungeons and things like that. So these auxiliary gameplay mechanics add to the game and the longevity of the game, and they add to these emotional experiences, which I think you see a lot less of. And that's partly because there's less of the world. There's less of this community. There's less of this immersion in it. And I think there's also this kind of immersion of crafting. And I talked about this a little bit earlier, but there's almost kind of this excitement with finding that ore vein, or just focusing on something that's a little bit different and in slower paced. There's just, like I said, there's something peaceful about working on those trade skills and not really working on the core progression of the game. And like I said, I think some of this is because of the changing mentality and ideas of a lot of players towards World of Warcraft. But I do think that this immersion of crafting kind of has changed. And, really crafting, I don't think has ever gotten really a fair try, honestly, in World of Warcraft. I think there's a huge opportunity for crafting in MMORPGs, but it's such a difficult idea to accomplish. And so it's something that maybe is more of a product of its time, but regardless. And I think another thing too that has really affected World of Warcraft in so many different ways is elitism, gear score and keys, and mindset shift of the player. And like I said, some of this is kind of out of the control of the developers, but I think especially towards kind of more the Burning Crusade and Wrath, a kind of a focus on gear score where you needed to get a certain gear score or certain keys and stuff like that, that really changed the mindset of the player. And I think that the expansions and the focus on certain content types really almost encouraged that in so many different ways, where the new content that was released was basically new dungeons, new raids, and new arenas. And it's like you almost kind of got trapped in this cycle because you need to keep cranking out expansions to make money. And that was the cycle that you got into, and you almost ignore the world. You almost ignore this other aspect of the gameplay. And I know that there was other things that were added, like pet battles and stuff, but this kind of focus on what World of Warcraft was, which was the dungeons and the raids, changes the mindset of the players, and you kind of see this push towards elitism and gear score, which then makes people toxic, and then it hurts the community. And so you see this kind of spiraling effect. And of course, another thing that's really kind of hurt World of Warcraft in so many ways, but I think it's a later aspect, was a focus on too much add-ons. I mean, some of the add-ons nowadays are absolutely crazy. I used add-ons back in the day, but now it's just so crazy, and it's really hard to understand what's going on. And this is from someone that's, played a lot of World of Warcraft. And if I look at the modern iteration of World of Warcraft, it's really hard to know what's going on. And I think that, like I said, this is kind of more of a later term symptom, I think in a lot of ways has hurt the core gameplay within World of Warcraft. And like I said, there's been too much of a focus on the core progressions with raids and dungeons. There was this almost essentially neglect of the world, of the social community aspect of World of Warcraft, these progression systems that were not necessarily tied to the raids, the dungeons, and the arena seasons and stuff like that. And this kind of seasonal content where your gear was almost obsolete with every patch, like I said, almost further supports this erosion with gameplay and progression and things like that. And of course, I want to talk about another thing. So I think another thing that people are really absolutely not going to like are, I think arenas sort of kind of destroyed PvP in so many ways. And I did arenas back in the day. I got pretty far into it, but honestly, I always liked the world PvP aspect of things in Battlegrounds. I felt like that was more of the clear immersion of the world, this idea of the Horde versus the Alliance, where you would have city raids or these kind of open battles. And I think people loved this aspect of things. The Battlegrounds almost kind of also were a simulation of this, but when you kind of went into Battlegrounds and arenas, it almost kind of gamified the game. It became less about the world and it became more about these progression systems around PvP. And like I said, I think there was a missed opportunity with progression with PvP and there was so many things you could have done, but arenas kind of destroyed, I think, some idea of what the battle between the Horde and the Alliance was supposed to be and what it was. And ever since then, it kind of, there was less of a focus on that. And I think that there was a missed opportunity of not focusing as much on battleground progressions and trying to do teamwork and kind of a bigger battle situation. And so I think that is, another thing that kind of eroded the PvP community in so many different ways. And of course, I have to talk about this one. This is something that I feel extremely passionate about, and I know a lot of people love it, but I still to this day am bitter at the destruction of Alterac Valley, the best battleground, the old school Alterac Valley, where it was not just a rush mode to the end. There was something, I can't really remember the exact dynamic that happened, but basically they changed the number of guards and things like that basically changed the way that Alterac Valley was played in this kind of longer term aspect where there was the PvE aspect to help your side progress, or these big battles that were happening was so much fun. And it really, that if there was ever a battleground that kind of spoke to more of that Horde versus Alliance dynamic, that immersion of the world while still playing kind of in this kind of gamified space, it was Alterac Valley. And I'm still mad about the fact that gameplay was changed to that kind of more shorter term, fast-paced action, which was all about getting, I think it was called Marks of Honor, points for PvP to get your gear. It changed the way that the game played. And like I said, the underlying honor system I think was really good, but this kind of gamification of so many PvP elements really hurt things. But old Alterac Valley was so amazing. If you played it back in the day, so amazing. And of course, another thing that was so critical into the destruction of World of Warcraft was looking for group and looking for raid. And I understand why a lot of people, might disagree with me on this, because it helped to make more of your time worthwhile within the game. There's a lot of wasted time trying to find a priest or wanting everyone to experience dungeons and raids. And I can see the benefit of that. But like I said, you lose something with all these bonuses. You lose the sense of community. You lose the sociability within the gameplay because the looking for group dumbs down the content, or the looking for raid is the easy version of the raid and there's no communication. There's a lack of social dynamics within the video game itself. It destroys the immersion of the world because you're not traveling to the dungeon. It's just this mini game almost. It's this sectioned off part. You don't even know where the dungeon entrance is, and it destroys the immersion, and then it destroys the emotional resonance that you have with the video game itself. And so, a lot of people might agree with me on this one. A lot of people might totally disagree because there's this idea of, I should experience the content, or, there were so many things that wasted your time. And I understand that. But like I said in the past, there's so many things that while they waste your time or they're not ideal, they add the immersion, which is helping you to build the connection you have with this video game. And there's a fine balance between annoyance and immersion and all these things. It's a tough balance to strike. Some of it is a product of its time, but it's just something that erodes the overarching progression system and the core gameplay in so many different ways. And of course, the leveling experience has also completely changed. Now there's a lot more of a focus on rushing towards things. And I think that in vanilla WoW, there was kind of more of an actual experience at leveling. Alts kind of were another way to play the game, and leveling was kind of very fun in of itself. I loved going through the Barrens. I mean, the Barrens is one of my favorite zones, and I love all the quests, and it's just this awesome experience. Or doing Durotar or Stranglethorn Vale. I love Stranglethorn Vale. And so there's so many of these leveling experiences that I think changed to rushing. It was about, like I said, the focus on the end game, the focus on the dungeons and the raids and the arena seasons versus the World of Warcraft, the social and the immersion. It's like almost there was a philosophy change to things. And The leveling and expansions also kind of felt weird. Leveling also in World of Warcraft now has become a lot more story based. I think you saw that with Warlords of Draenor. And to be honest with you, I've always felt like it was a bit weird and I didn't really care for it. That might be just kind of a personal taste thing. But World of Warcraft, like I said, the world was more of a focus. And I know that people have analyzed the lore of the world, but I think the lore of the world was less important. I mean, I think that the average person did not really care about the lore of the Dead Mines, even though people analyze it now. I mean, I think some people did, but it was less about that. And I think that the leveling with the story component, maybe that works for something like Final Fantasy XIV, but I think that it kind of altered World of Warcraft in the sense of community and stuff. And so it goes back to that core essence of the immersion and the sense of World of Warcraft that I was talking about earlier. And of course, lastly, and this is another thing that was kind of a late term destruction thing, was player fortresses, player holds. I can't remember what it was in Warlords of Draenor, but it kind of changed the dynamic where it added more of a sense of isolation. You kind of have these personal banks, auction houses, and stuff like that, which just is another thing that changes the identity of the game. It changes the gameplay and the socialization of the video game, kind of alters things in so many ways. And so just a couple of other things to talk about beyond those four is I feel like the story has dramatically shifted for the worse. And this kind of coincided with the deviations from Warcraft 3. So, pretty much anything post Wrath of the Lich King. So a lot of people played Warcraft 3, Reign of Chaos, The Frozen Throne. And so they have this kind of association with Arthas, with Wrath of the Lich King, or with Illidan and Burning Crusade, or just some of the characters like Thrall and stuff like that, Jaina. And so, the story in a lot of ways, I think, worked in the first three aspects of the game, Burning Crusade, Wrath of the Lich King, and Vanilla. And then once you kind of started deviating from that into Mists of Pandaria and Cataclysm, I think you saw a lot of people lose something. And there also is just kind of this, I think the story is just fundamentally worse now. The Alliance versus the Horde dynamic has fundamentally changed its identity. And I think like that was a core conflict that really added edge to the game, and it added just kind of this nice sense of just world building to the overall game in of itself. There definitely seems to be a lack of edge, a core essence of what World of Warcraft really was. And I think that ultimately, a lot of this is this kind of philosophical change from the devs in terms of storytelling and stuff like that. But the other thing too is I just think that like there's just too much of an emphasis on story. I think that, like I said, the identity of World of Warcraft with regards to this has changed, but I don't think World of Warcraft was supposed to be something like Final Fantasy XIV, where it was kind of a more story-based MMORPG. It's a lot more of the world as the main character, and you're just a nobody in the game. And I think when you became the hero and you started trying to be involved in the story and stuff like that, it changed the, once again, RPG mechanics, the immersion, the progression of the world, and stuff like that. And the other thing too is that along with all the things that I mentioned with World of Warcraft, there really is something really key to kind of just talk about. And ultimately, there's been a philosophical change within the devs. I mean, that's just the fundamental thing that you have to look at, where if you look at the people that are making World of Warcraft now, there's just such a dramatic philosophy change that, the ideas that I'm talking about, I think that they're relevant for a new video game, a new MMORPG or something like that. But the problems within World of Warcraft are so deep that people that are in charge have such a different philosophy that some of these ideas are happening because of their philosophy, right? Whether it's from a storytelling perspective or when they started World of Warcraft, how they think about what this game is. And like I said, I kind of grouped up World of Warcraft players into those three kind of sections, right? The Wrath, Burning Crusade, Vanilla. Then you have the Cataclysm, Mists of Pandaria, Legion, and then kind of the more newer style, which is Dragonflight, BFA, Shadowlands, stuff like that. And so each player kind of has a different perspective on what World of Warcraft is, what kind of game it is. It's not about social and community. It's not about world building and slower pace. It's about fast pace. It's about this progression. It's about playing the patch and stuff like that. And obviously there's clearly a market for it, but ultimately, the game can exist in its current form because of the work that the game did in the past. And philosophically, I think the way you see that raids have gone, PvP, that has been the philosophical change within the devs, which ultimately drives a lot of the things that we're seeing today. And ultimately, too, the culture of gaming has changed. Gaming is so different than what it was like in 2004, 2005, that fundamentally alters the game. I mean, even if you tried to implement and go back to some of the ideas that I mentioned in this video, so much of it would be so hard to achieve with streamers, right? The streamers almost kind of take this outside influence from the world and they inject it into the MMORPG, which changes the server reputation dynamic that I was talking about, or the way that people socialize on the internet is very different than 2004. And so because gaming has changed and there's more of a focus on progression and beating things fast and stuff like that, the game is going to be different. And it's hard to get back to those things that I was talking about. But ultimately, they're all these really great ideas that I think could make any new video game amazing if you kind of take those core ideas. And, some things that I always thought would be really interesting ideas with World of Warcraft that I just wanted to kind of talk about very, very quickly was like, I always thought it'd be interesting if World of Warcraft had something like the Wilderness from old school RuneScape, or it had something like EVE Online where there was like, let's say, a zone that had basically this crazy raid, and it was an open world raid, and so you had to go out there, but if you died in that place, you lost your gear. And so this could add a playing field for PvPers where people would go grind gear, and then maybe some of the gear that was used in this kind of World of Warcraft wilderness was created by crafters. And so you add this dynamic of crafting, and because people lose the gear, it adds a reason for people to grind resources in the world, and adds kind of incentives for crafters to level up that skill. And it keeps the PvP people happy. It adds a sense of immersion and danger. People can risk things. You could have these crazy viral moments with raid gear or stuff like that. And it adds a level of community to things. And of course, there's things you have to watch out for with like bots and things like that. But I always thought it was an interesting idea that, World of Warcraft could try to do, going more into crafting and trying to make crafting more integrated into the world. So rather than just having like a sword drop from a raid boss, you dropped dragon scales, which are used to craft the two-handed sword. And so it added maybe a connection with crafting in the world, or just going deeper into the integration of the world, not really trying to add these areas that were like kind of in Northrend or something, but like you added a new dungeon in Durotar, you added kind of an evolving world, kind of like the Encourage event in vanilla World of Warcraft, where you could have things that were changing, maybe patch where the Horde is building a new port in Tanarus, and the Alliance are also building something, and then you can have this kind of sea conflict happen temporarily, and you could have this kind of more integration in the world where parts of the old world are not obsolescent anymore, but you have kind of something new right there in the world, and it kind of builds this integration with new players and old players, and it keeps things still relevant. And I think that when I look at World of Warcraft, and something that I think bothers me, there seems to be this kind of locust idea where there's players going, this doesn't concern you. I just want the flying mount. Why are you trying to make people not have fun? I want to experience the raid. Let me enjoy the game. And it's almost like this locust that destroys the farmland. It destroys the idea because there's these core gameplay ideas that you have to be true to. That it's what makes the game fun. It's what makes the game so emotionally resonating with so many people. And you almost kind of see the locust destroy the farmland, right? When you grow the crops, after growing the crops, the land has to rest. You have to let the land rest. And if you don't let the land rest, the land becomes barren because you over farmed the land. And it's almost like this locust does not care. I don't care if you destroy the farmland. Just let me have it. Let's do it again. Let's plant the farm again. Even though it is destroyed, it doesn't matter. The locust is gone. It's moving on to its next target, its next idea. And so I almost feel like this is something that has kind of happened to World of Warcraft, where there's this locust idea of just let these things happen. It's fine. It's in the short term. I just want this. And it destroys the core identity of the game, destroys the immersion and the things that really made this game so amazing for so many different people. And ultimately, when I think about it, for me, World of Warcraft's decline came down to 15 core reasons, though there are plenty of others that could have made the list. So number 1, flying mounts. Number 2, sharding and the elimination of server identity. 3, the general destruction of the community. 4, gear invalidation from expansions and patch cycles. 5, the separation of the player base, especially from expansions. 6, looking for group and looking for raid. 7, the erosion of PvP. 8, transmog. 9, microtransactions. 10, the focus on the raid and arena patch and expansion cycle. 11, the ease of obtaining epic gear and the deterioration of the sense of progression. 12, the degradation of class identity. 13, the loss of RPG mechanics. 14, the decline in storytelling. 15, and finally, and most importantly, the philosophical change of the game. When I was making this video, I kept trying to think of what my favorite memory of World of Warcraft was, because I couldn't really choose one, to be honest with you. And after some contemplation, for me, it was the people who made World of Warcraft. That's what made this game so special. Like from the priest or mage on the road, giving you a random buff to help you on your leveling journey, that nice surprise, to the epic PvP and 1v1 battles, even the ones that you lost, to that guild that you were part of where you overcame those dungeons and raids, to that one person who helped you with that boss in the Barrens. That's what makes this game so special for me in the end. And the truth is, and I really believe this, keys to the next masterpiece game are already here. There's no secrets. It's buried within World of Warcraft. And I really don't think that WoW is coming back to what it once was, not even with the sequel. And that's sad. It really is. It's sad, but it's okay. Because take heart in the memories that you made and let them remind you to enjoy the ones that you're making right now at this very moment in your own life. Thanks for listening, everyone.